Harold Whitaker was the kind of man who had earned his peace. After decades of service in the military, including long deployments overseas and nights filled with uncertainty, he finally retired to the countryside. The little slice of land he bought with his savings wasn't extravagant, but it was everything he wanted. Nestled at the edge of town, it was quiet, private, and dotted with tall oaks and maples. The heart of the property was his pride and joy, a large pond he had stocked with bass and catfish years earlier. Fishing there became his favorite pastime. For Harold, it wasn't about the catch. It was about the stillness, the reflection, and the sense of calm that came from casting a line into waters he had nurtured with his own hands. The pond had a story of its own. When Harold first bought the property, it was more of a muddy swamp than a pond. Over time, he invested his money, sweat, and labor into transforming it. He cleared brush, deepened the basin, and hired professionals to line it and stock it. For him, the pond was not just a feature of the land, it was a personal accomplishment. Every ripple in its water reminded him of resilience and patience. His neighbors often waved from afar, admiring how peaceful the setting looked. But not everyone shared that appreciation. 2 years after Harold had settled in, a new couple moved into the subdivision next to his property. Their house, larger and newer than Harold's cabin, stood just across the narrow road that divided the community from his land. They were middle-aged, wealthy, and determined to leave their mark on the neighborhood. The wife, Brenda, though everyone soon started referring to her as Karen behind her back, developed a reputation almost immediately. She took it upon herself to monitor lawns, count cars in driveways, and police the behavior of children riding bicycles. The neighborhood's homeowners association adored her enthusiasm, but the residents quickly grew weary of her endless complaints and entitled attitude. Karen's favorite pastime was finding something, or someone, to correct, and from the day she noticed Harold by his pond, she set her sights on him. She didn't like the sight of a man fishing just beyond her window view, nor did she appreciate that the pond was entirely his and not part of the neighborhood's shared amenities. From her perspective, it seemed wrong that one man could enjoy such a luxury without being accountable to the HOA. In her mind, if something existed near the subdivision, it ought to fall under her influence. The first time she marched over to confront Harold, she left frustrated. He had listened politely, nodded, and then turned back to his fishing rod as if she hadn't spoken at all. That quiet dismissal infuriated her more than if he had argued back. She wanted resistance she could challenge, not calm indifference. Karen started muttering to neighbors that the pond must be a safety hazard, or maybe it even attracts mosquitoes. Soon, whispers circulated that she planned to do something about it. But Harold, ever patient, brushed off the gossip. He had lived long enough to know that some people thrived on conflict. He refused to let Karen's theatrics rob him of his peace. Every morning, just as the sun rose, he carried his folding chair down to the pond, cast his line, and sat in silence. It was his sanctuary, and no neighbor, no matter how determined, would push him away from it. Karen, however, grew restless. To her, Harold's stubborn calm wasn't admirable, it was infuriating. She began taking photos of him from across the road, zooming in on his fishing pole, his bucket, even his tackle box. She told anyone who would listen that Harold was breaking laws by fishing without a license. She suggested the pond might not even belong to him, since it looked so large and well kept. By twisting the narrative, she convinced herself, and tried to convince others, that Harold was doing something wrong. The situation came to a boiling point one Saturday afternoon. Harold was enjoying a particularly pleasant day, with the soft sound of frogs croaking nearby and dragonflies skating across the water. His rod was steady, his line stretched into the center of the pond. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, soaking in the peace he had built for himself. From behind, across the road, Karen stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, scowling. She snapped a few more photos, muttered to herself, and finally pulled out her phone. This time, she wasn't going to just gossip to the HOA. This time, she was calling the police. She told the dispatcher that there was an old man trespassing and fishing without a license. She claimed he was using the pond illegally and demanded immediate action. To Karen, it was her moment of triumph. She imagined officers arriving, questioning Harold, and escorting him away. She imagined herself explaining to the neighbors that she had protected the community. In her fantasy, she would be the hero. The squad car pulled up about 20 minutes later, its lights flashing gently as it rolled onto the gravel edge of Harold's property. Karen rushed to meet the officers, waving them down like she had discovered a major crime in progress. Pointing across the grass, she exaggerated every detail, describing Harold as though he were a dangerous intruder. The officers, trained to remain neutral, listened but made no promises. They walked down the slope toward the pond, where Harold sat calmly, rod in hand, as though he hadn't noticed any of the commotion. For Harold, it was not the first time life had brought him confrontation. But he also knew that peace was best preserved by preparation. He had something Karen had not expected, something that would soon turn the situation on its head and leave her red-faced in front of everyone watching. And as the officers approached, their eyes shifting between Karen's accusations and Harold's serene demeanor, the stage was set for a revelation that would shatter Karen's narrative entirely. The two officers walked slowly down the slope toward Harold, their boots crunching on the gravel path. They weren't in a hurry, nor did they appear hostile. They had heard the kind of call Karen made countless times before. Vague accusations from a neighbor who seemed more annoyed than endangered. But protocol demanded that they at least check, confirm the situation, and document it. Behind them, Karen trailed with a look of satisfaction, her arms pumping like she was leading a parade. She glanced at the houses across the road, hoping. Neighbors were peeking through their blinds to witness her victory. Harold didn't move from his chair. He kept one hand loosely holding his fishing rod, the line stretched calmly across the water. The other hand rested on his knee. His posture carried the kind of stillness that made people feel small in comparison. When the officers greeted him politely, Harold finally turned, nodding with a slow smile. He already knew what this was about. Karen wasted no time. She started rattling off her complaints in a rapid stream, waving her hands toward Harold, insisting that he was fishing illegally, that the pond was not his, and that she had proof he was breaking state law by not holding a license. The officers let her vent, but their eyes stayed on Harold. They were trained to notice body language, and Harold wasn't tense, defensive, or evasive. He looked like a man waiting patiently for the world to catch up with him. When she finally stopped to breathe, one of the officers asked Harold if he had any documentation regarding the property. Harold gave a small nod, set down his rod, and reached into the old leather satchel at his feet. From it, he pulled out a large envelope, thick with papers that had been carefully preserved. He handed it to the officer without a word. Inside were the original property deeds, survey maps, and permits dating back to the year Harold bought the land. The pond itself was marked clearly within the boundary lines. There were also receipts, from when he hired contractors to excavate and line the pond, and even invoices for the fish stock he had purchased years earlier. It wasn't just documentation. It was an entire record of ownership and stewardship. The officer flipped through the pages with practiced ease. Each document carried Harold's name, his signature and official stamps. There was no question. This wasn't a public pond, nor was it shared property. It was private, built and maintained entirely by Harold, and most importantly, private. Property ponds fell under different regulations than public waters. Harold didn't need a state fishing license to cast a line in his own pond. He could fish there every day for the rest of his life if he wanted to, and it would be perfectly legal. Karen's expression began to falter. She leaned forward, trying to glance at the papers as though searching for a loophole, but the officer holding them shook his head gently. With calm authority, he explained that Harold was on his own property, that the pond was his by legal deed, and that no laws were being broken. Fishing without a license, he clarified, only applied to public waters or private ones where the owner had not given consent. In this case, Harold was the owner and the fisherman. The words hit Karen like stones. For weeks she had built up this confrontation in her mind, imagining Harold being scolded or even fined. She had believed so strongly in her own narrative that the reality was jarring. Her face reddened as she stammered, insisting there must be some mistake, that the pond looked too big to be private, or that Harold couldn't possibly afford to maintain something like that. But the officers were unmoved. They had the paperwork in their hands, black and white proof that left no room for doubt. Harold, for his part, remained silent. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't say anything at all. His silence was more powerful than words. It made Karen's protest sound petty and hollow, echoing against the calm authority of official documentation. The officers eventually handed the papers back, thanked Harold for his cooperation, and turned to Karen with a subtle but unmistakable edge in their tone. They explained that making false or exaggerated reports wasted law enforcement's time. While they wouldn't issue a citation this time, they advised her to consider carefully before making future calls. Karen's mouth opened as though to argue, but she stopped herself. The realization that she wasn't being seen as the heroic protector she imagined was sinking in. Instead, she looked like what the neighbors had always whispered, a busybody who couldn't mind her own business. And now, she had dragged the police into her obsession, only to be proven wrong in front of them. The officers left shortly afterward, their car pulling away from the gravel drive. Harold quietly tucked his papers back into the envelope, set his satchel beside his chair, and picked up his fishing rod again. The moment seemed to reset, as though nothing had happened. The pond rippled gently, the breeze moved through the trees, and Harold returned to the peace he had cultivated. But Karen wasn't finished. Though she had been humiliated, her pride wouldn't let her accept defeat. She stomped back across the road to her house, her mind already spinning with ways to regain control of the narrative. To her, Harold had embarrassed her in front of authority, and that was something she couldn't tolerate. She started plotting a new strategy, one that wouldn't rely on police, but would instead use the HOA and neighborhood politics as her weapon. From her window that evening, Karen watched Harold still sitting at the edge of his pond, his silhouette calm against the setting sun. The sight only deepened her resentment. If she couldn't win legally, she would try another route. She began drafting emails, writing to the HOA board, and making calls to allies in the neighborhood. Her next attack wouldn't come in the form of flashing police lights. It would come in the form of rules, fines, and relentless complaints designed to push Harold into submission. What Karen didn't realize, however, was that Harold was not a man easily rattled. His life had taught him patience, strategy, and resilience. If she thought she could push him off his land, she was about to discover that she had underestimated the strength of the man who owned that pond. The battle was far from over. Karen's humiliation at the hands of Harold's paperwork burned hotter than she expected. For days afterward, she could hardly stand to glance across the road without her stomach tightening in anger. The old man had embarrassed her in front of the police, reduced her triumphant plan to ashes, and made her look like a fool in the eyes of the neighborhood. Her pride wouldn't let her forgive it. She couldn't move on, not when his calm, unbothered presence by the pond reminded her of her failure every single morning. Instead of retreating, she began plotting her next attack. If the police wouldn't remove him, then perhaps the HOA could. In Karen's mind, Harold's property may have been legally his, but that didn't mean he couldn't be pressured, fined, or forced to comply with standards of the community. And if she could frame his pond and his fishing habits as a nuisance, then maybe the board would be persuaded to act. Her first step was to write a formal complaint. She spent hours typing it out, using the kind of language that made ordinary. Grievances sound like matters of public safety. She described the pond as unsightly, claiming it attracted dangerous wildlife. She said the fishing was unsanitary and implied that Harold was dumping chemicals into the water. She even suggested the pond lowered property values for the homes nearby. None of it was true, but Karen didn't care. She was crafting a narrative, just as she had when she called the police. The key wasn't accuracy, it was persistence and persuasion. By the time the complaint landed in the HOA's inbox, Karen was already calling board members one by one, making her case with exaggerated urgency. She told them she had already involved law enforcement and that something needed to be done. The board, accustomed to her constant complaints, wasn't immediately convinced. Still, Karen knew how to wear people down. She peppered them with emails, cornered them during neighborhood walks, and dropped thick folders of evidence on their porches. She wouldn't stop until they took her side. Harold, meanwhile, continued with his quiet routines. Every morning he was out by the pond, chair unfolded, fishing rod in hand. He didn't need to know exactly what Karen was up to. He could feel it in the way her curtains shifted when she spied on him, the way her car slowed when she passed his drive. He knew enough about people like her to recognize that she wasn't finished. But Harold wasn't the kind of man to panic. He had his paperwork, his legal rights, and his patience. Whatever storm she was brewing, he was prepared to weather it. The storm broke a few weeks later when Harold received his first letter from the HOA. The envelope, stamped with official-looking seals, carried a tone of authority. Inside, the letter claimed that his pond violated community aesthetic standards. It demanded that he remove unsightly debris and comply with landscaping requirements or face escalating fines. Harold read it slowly, then folded it neatly and set it aside. He had lived on his land long before the subdivision grew around it, and his property was not under HOA jurisdiction. The board had no authority over him. The letter was nothing more than a bluff. Still, the letters kept coming. Each one was more aggressive than the last, threatening higher fines and even legal action if Harold failed to comply. Karen had successfully rallied enough board members to join her crusade, and now the HOA machinery was being aimed squarely at Harold. Neighbors began whispering about the fight across the road, some siding with Harold, others rolling their eyes at Karen's antics. The tension spread through the community like ripples across water. Karen, however, was emboldened. She bragged to her friends that the HOA was finally doing something about that pond. She walked with a new strut in her step, convinced she was closing in on victory. She dreamed of the day Harold would be forced to drain his pond, pack up his fishing gear, and surrender to the rules she clung to so tightly. To her, it wasn't just about the pond anymore. It was about control. She couldn't stand the idea of someone living outside the reach of her authority, but Harold wasn't shaken. When the third letter arrived, he decided it was time to respond. He gathered his documents again, deeds, surveys, exemption statements, all proving that his property predated the subdivision and was explicitly outside of HOA governance. With a firm but polite letter of his own, he enclosed copies of the paperwork and mailed them directly to the board. His message was clear. Their demands held no legal weight, and any further harassment could be considered harassment under property law. The board wasn't expecting such a detailed, airtight rebuttal. When they reviewed Harold's paperwork, they realized quickly that he was right. His land was private, independent, and untouchable. The pond was his, the fishing was his, and the HOA had absolutely no jurisdiction over him. Quietly, the board members backed away, realizing Karen had dragged them into a losing battle. But Karen, stubborn as ever, didn't accept their retreat. When she found out the board had dropped the matter, she erupted in rage. To her, the paperwork didn't matter. She still believed Harold was wrong simply because she didn't like what he was doing. And if the HOA wouldn't fight for her, she decided she'd take matters into her own hands. One evening, as Harold sat watching the sun dip behind the trees, he noticed Karen pacing along the road with her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice carried faintly across the quiet air, sharp and angry. Though he couldn't make out every word, he caught enough to understand she was rallying support again. This time, not just from neighbors or the HOA, but from anyone she thought could make life harder for him. She wasn't letting go. For Harold, the letters and threats had been nothing more than annoyances. But now, with Karen escalating again, he knew the conflict was moving to a new level. He could feel the battle lines shifting, stretching beyond HOA politics into something more personal, more invasive. The pond remained calm, its surface reflecting the twilight sky, but Harold sensed that the peace he cherished was about to be tested in ways even he hadn't anticipated. The war between Karen and the veteran was far from over, and the next round would be uglier than anything so far. The defeat with the HOA stung Karen like salt on an open wound. She had invested weeks of effort into pushing the board against Harold, and in the end, her target had slipped through her fingers with a stack of paperwork. The board's retreat was humiliating. She had promised neighbors she would get results, only to have the very people she relied on quietly step back, unwilling to face the strength of Harold's case. But Karen wasn't built for retreat. She was built for persistence, fueled by pride and the inability to admit when she was wrong. If the HOA wouldn't fight for her, she decided she would recruit other forces. Her mind raced with possibilities: local code enforcement, zoning offices, animal control, environmental agencies. There had to be some rule Harold was breaking. All she had to do was find it. Her first call was to the county zoning office. She complained that the pond was unnatural and possibly not permitted. She described it as a large water feature built without oversight, hoping to trigger an inspection. A week later, a county official stopped by Harold's property, clipboard in hand. Karen practically ran to her window to watch, expecting the pond to be flagged as illegal. But once again, Harold's foresight paid off. The official walked the property, reviewed Harold's papers, and confirmed the pond had been built entirely within legal boundaries. Permits had been filed, inspections had been passed, and everything was in order. Within 20 minutes, the official left with nothing more than a nod of approval. Harold went back to fishing before Karen could even process her second defeat. Undeterred, Karen shifted her strategy. She called animal control, insisting that the pond was attracting dangerous wildlife. She exaggerated sightings of snakes, claimed raccoons were running wild, and even suggested the water might be drawing coyotes closer to the neighborhood. Once again, an officer visited Harold's property, inspected the pond's perimeter, and found nothing out of the ordinary. A few frogs, a handful of turtles, and some dragonflies. That was all. The officer left with a smile, telling Harold to enjoy his day. Karen's frustration grew. Each attempt backfired, not only failing to stop Harold, but also reinforcing the legitimacy of his pond. The more she fought, the more unshakable his position became. Neighbors began to notice, whispering about how Karen had turned her vendetta into a full-blown obsession. While Harold remained the picture of patience, Karen was unraveling, her behavior drawing more attention than Harold's quiet fishing ever had. Yet Karen still refused to give up. Late one evening, she sat at her desk, scrolling through community forums and legal websites, searching for loopholes. She stumbled upon environmental regulations about water contamination and saw her next opportunity. If she could convince authorities that Harold's pond was a hazard to local water quality, maybe she could finally force action. The next week, she made anonymous reports to the Environmental Health Department. She claimed Harold was dumping waste into the pond and suggested it was seeping into groundwater. Inspectors arrived with testing equipment, and Karen nearly burst with anticipation. She stood in her yard pretending to water plants, sneaking glances across the road. As the men collected water samples, she imagined headlines about contamination. Harold fined heavily, maybe even forced to fill in the pond. But days later, the results came back clean. The water was pure, even healthier than some natural streams in the area. The inspectors noted that Harold's care, keeping the pond clear, using no chemicals, maintaining balance, had actually made it a thriving ecosystem. Far from being a hazard, it was a model of private conservation. When Karen overheard the inspectors praising Harold's upkeep, she nearly dropped her watering can. She had hoped for a scandal, but ended up watching her target receive compliments from professionals. The humiliation was unbearable. By now, Harold knew Karen's handprints were behind every inspection. He said nothing, but the pattern was obvious. Each time a stranger with a clipboard arrived, Harold calmly showed his papers, answered questions, and returned to his chair by the pond. To him, Karen's obsession was a storm circling his calm island, loud but powerless. Still, he understood something deeper. Obsession rarely burned out on its own. The more Karen failed, the more desperate she would become, and Harold was right. After her string of defeats, Karen's tactics turned from official complaints to personal harassment. She started walking the road in front of Harold's property more often, glaring openly at him as he fished. She snapped pictures every chance she got, muttering under her breath when she thought he couldn't hear. At night, she sat at her computer firing off angry posts to neighborhood groups, painting Harold as selfish, unsafe, and disrespectful. Some neighbors ignored her. Others defended Harold, reminding everyone that he had lived there first, that the pond was his pride and joy. But a handful of residents, swayed by Karen's relentless complaints, began to grumble about property values and community standards. Karen seized on their support, convincing herself that she was gaining momentum again. One evening, Harold noticed something new. On the HOA's bulletin board by the entrance of the subdivision, a flyer had been pinned up with bold letters, "Concern." About the pond. Is it time for action? Though unsigned, the tone was unmistakably Karen's. The flyer urged residents to attend the next community meeting to discuss the risks of Harold's pond. It painted him as a stubborn loner, unwilling to listen to reasonable concerns. For Harold, this was no longer about fishing. It was about principle. Karen had turned his personal sanctuary into a battlefield, dragging his reputation into the mud. And though Harold valued peace, he also knew when to stand firm. The upcoming meeting would not just be another attempt by Karen to smear his name. It would be the stage where Harold finally drew a line in the sand. The calm pond reflected the evening sky as Harold packed away his fishing rod that night. The water looked as serene as ever, but beneath its still surface, a storm was gathering. The community was being pulled into Karen's obsession, and Harold knew the next chapter of this conflict would be decided not by paperwork or inspectors, but by how he faced his neighbors directly. The flyer that appeared on the HOA bulletin board spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors who rarely attended community meetings suddenly circled the date on their calendars. Curiosity buzzed through the subdivision. Some wondered if Harold had actually been breaking rules all along, while others suspected Karen was stirring up trouble again. Either way, the promise of drama was enough to draw a crowd. On the evening of the meeting, the clubhouse parking lot overflowed with cars. Residents filled every seat inside, their voices humming with anticipation. Karen arrived early, clutching, a binder stuffed with papers, photographs, and highlighted notes. She strutted to the front row, her lips pressed into a determined line. To her, this was the night she would finally bring Harold down, not through police or inspectors, but through public opinion. If she could convince enough neighbors that his pond was a problem, the pressure would force him to yield. Harold, on the other hand, arrived quietly. Dressed simply in his old jacket, he carried the same leather satchel he always kept by his side. He didn't need binders or flyers. He only needed the truth, which was written in the black ink of his deeds and permits. As he entered the room, heads turned, and whispers rippled through the crowd. Some greeted him with nods of respect, while others avoided eye contact, not wanting to choose sides too soon. The HOA president called the meeting to order, his voice carrying more tension than usual. Everyone knew why they were there. Before he could finish his opening remarks, Karen shot her hand into the air and demanded to speak. The president, looking weary from months of her relentless complaints, gave her the floor. Karen launched into her performance with practiced precision. She waved her photos, insisting Harold's pond was unsafe, unsanitary, and lowering property values. She painted vivid pictures of children drowning, snakes infesting yards, and coyotes prowling through the streets. Her words grew louder and sharper with every sentence, her face flushed with the heat of self-righteousness. Some neighbors nodded uneasily, swayed by the imagery. Others crossed their arms, skeptical of her dramatics. A few glanced toward Harold, wondering how he would respond. Karen, sensing she had an audience, pressed harder. She claimed she had called authorities multiple times and that everyone agreed there was a problem, carefully omitting the fact that each official had left with no issue found. Her binder slapped against the table for emphasis, the sound echoing through the tense room. When she finally finished, she sat down with a triumphant smirk. The silence that followed was heavy. All eyes turned to Harold. Slowly, he rose from his chair. He didn't wave papers in the air or raise his voice. He simply opened his satchel, pulled out his envelope of documents, and placed them neatly on the table at the front. With measured calm, he explained what each paper represented: the deed showing his ownership, the permits proving the pond's legality, the inspection reports confirming its safety, and even letters from the environmental department praising its health. His voice was steady, deliberate, unshaken. As he spoke, the contrast between him and Karen became impossible to ignore. She had ranted with emotion, but he delivered facts with quiet authority. He didn't embellish or exaggerate. He didn't attack her personally. He simply presented the truth, layer by layer, until there was no doubt left in the room. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Some who had nodded along with Karen now avoided her gaze, realizing they had been misled. Others murmured to each other, impressed by Harold's composure. The HOA president leaned forward, scanning the documents, his frown deepening as he recognized their authenticity. When Harold finished, he closed his envelope and looked around the room. His final words weren't about Karen or even about himself. They were about the principle of peace, the right of a man to enjoy his land without harassment, and the importance of truth over rumor. His message resonated with the crowd in a way Karen's theatrics never could. The president cleared his throat and announced that Harold was fully within his rights. The pond was private, legal, and well-maintained. The HOA had no jurisdiction, and any further complaints about it would not be entertained. A small wave of applause broke out, scattered at first, then growing louder as more neighbors joined in. Karen's face turned crimson. She tried to interject, but her words were drowned out by the sound of her own neighbors siding against her. The smirk she had worn earlier was gone, replaced with a thin, trembling line of frustration. For the first time, she realized she wasn't the leader she thought she was. She was the spectacle. As the meeting ended, Harold was surrounded by neighbors offering handshakes and words of support. Some admitted they had doubted him at first, but were glad to see the truth laid bare. Karen, meanwhile, slipped out of the clubhouse with her binder clutched to her chest, her pride in tatters. But humiliation doesn't always breed humility. For Karen, it brewed something darker. The more she lost, the more determined she became to win, no matter the cost. And as Harold walked home under the calm night sky, he didn't realize that Karen's obsession hadn't ended. It had merely shifted. She had tried the police, the HOA, the county, and even the community itself. Each time, she failed. But to Karen, failure wasn't the end. It was fuel. The final chapter of their battle was yet to come, and it would push both of them further than ever before. The night of the community meeting lingered in Karen's mind like a wound that wouldn't heal. Every replay of the evening burned hotter than the last. Harold standing calm and composed, the neighbors clapping, the HOA dismissing her crusade. She had walked out of the clubhouse not as the protector of the neighborhood, but as its laughingstock. Her binder of evidence felt heavier than bricks in her arms. Days turned into weeks, but Karen's humiliation didn't fade. If anything, it grew sharper each time she saw Harold by his pond. There he was again, every morning, his chair unfolded, his fishing rod steady, his silhouette reflected in the calm water. He didn't gloat. He didn't taunt. He simply existed. And that infuriated her most of all. To Karen, his silence was worse than words. It was indifference, and indifference was unbearable to someone who lived on control. Her obsession reached a breaking point. She had tried every official channel: police, HOA, county, environmental inspectors, and failed. She had rallied neighbors and been publicly dismissed. She had been left red-faced at every turn. But in her mind, there was still one option left. If the system wouldn't stop Harold, then she would stop him herself. One late evening, long after most of the neighborhood had gone to bed, Karen slipped outside with a flashlight in hand. She marched across the road, her heart pounding with adrenaline. Her plan was simple but reckless. She would prove Harold's pond was a nuisance by stirring up trouble herself. If she could dump trash along its edge or disrupt the water, she could later claim it was his doing, forcing officials to take notice. But Karen had underestimated Harold once again. The veteran, cautious and prepared by nature, had noticed her growing desperation. After the meeting, he installed a small set of motion-activated cameras around his pond. They were discreet, nestled between branches and fence posts, recording silently every night. Harold didn't want confrontation. He Wanted proof just in case Karen's obsession pushed her too far. And now it had. The cameras caught everything. Karen trespassing, Karen scattering bags of leaves and debris at the water's edge, Karen snapping photos of her own sabotage, preparing to twist them into evidence against Harold. She worked quickly, glancing around nervously, unaware that the quiet red glow of a recording light had just captured her downfall. The next morning, Harold reviewed the footage calmly over his coffee. There it was, undeniable proof of Karen's harassment. For the first time since the ordeal began, Harold allowed himself a thin smile. She had crossed the line, and now he had everything he needed to end this war once and for all. Later that week, Harold invited the HOA president and a handful of board members to his property. He didn't rant, he didn't rage. He simply set a laptop on his porch table and pressed play. The footage rolled, showing Karen under the cover of night, trespassing, littering, and staging her false claims. The board members sat stunned, their mouths tight with disbelief. They had seen Karen at her most dramatic in meetings, but this was something else entirely. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the end of the day, nearly everyone had heard that Karen had been caught red-handed. Her reputation, already fragile, collapsed completely. Neighbors who had once tolerated her constant nagging now crossed the street to avoid her. Whispers followed her everywhere, and the nickname Karen became less a joke and more a label she couldn't escape. The HOA, embarrassed by how far she had dragged them into her obsession, issued a formal statement declaring Harold entirely within his rights and condemning Karen's behavior. They stopped just short of expelling her from the board, but the message was clear. She had no authority left, and Harold? He didn't even need to press charges. The humiliation alone was punishment enough. He kept the footage saved, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of how far obsession could drive a person. He never gloated, never bragged. He simply returned to his chair by the pond, his fishing line stretching calmly into the water as though nothing had ever disturbed his peace. For Karen, the defeat was absolute. She had tried every weapon in her arsenal: police, HOA, inspectors, neighbors, even sabotage. And each one had backfired. She was left with nothing but the bitter taste of her own pride. No amount of excuses could erase the image of her caught in the act, broadcast through the grapevine of the neighborhood. In the weeks that followed, the subdivision quieted. Without Karen's constant complaints dominating conversations, neighbors seemed lighter, friendlier. Some even started waving to Harold as they passed, offering nods of respect for the way he had handled everything. His pond, once the center of drama, became again what it had always been, a place of peace, reflection, and calm. And Harold, ever patient, never once brought up Karen's downfall. He didn't need to. The truth had spoken for itself, louder than any words could. The veteran had faced many battles in his life, but this one, strange as it was, ended not with shouting or force, but with quiet resilience. In the end, Karen wasn't defeated by Harold. She was defeated by her own obsession. The pond remained. The fishing continued. And Harold, the man who just wanted peace, finally had it again.